Hello and welcome to USISPF Conversations, where we showcase the brilliance of our experts, riveting conversations, and veterans of the industry. And my guest today epitomizes that very expertise, one of the doyens of India's foreign policy, who's not just worked at the highest echelons of the Ministry of External Affairs, but has helped shape, craft the narrative, how India sees the world, and equally important, of how the world sees India. I am delighted to be joined by the inimitable Ambassador Nirupama Rao, former Foreign Secretary, former Ambassador of India to the United States, China, High Commissioner Sri Lanka, and spokesperson for the MEA during a very illustrious career.
Thank you for inviting me on the show.
Delighted to have you here. And thank you as well, Ambassador. So I wanted to ask you, Ambassador, when you first took the reins at India House, it was a different time in the relationship. We were seeing the effects of the post-civil nuclear deal, where a decade before that we had nuclear sanctions. So to go from nuclear sanctions to this epochal nuclear deal within a decade, and then from there that set the landmark for India to be designated the major defense partner under the Obama administration. We had the SDA one. Then, President Biden convened the Quad Leaders Summit in 2021, and then ISET, Indusex, a state visit, Trust and Compact earlier this year. So from all of that, in the last few months, it's sort of been unraveling in the relationship. So how do we put this down? Who could have seen this coming?
Well, I agree with you. It's a very unprecedented time in the relationship and a season of stormy weather, if one can put it that way. As you pointed out, the civil nuclear breakthrough created a strategic runway for our relationship with the United States. And then you had the designation of major defense partner, STA1, the Quad maturing, ISET, Indusex, and now newer umbrellas like Trust and Compact. So all that are the strategic assets parked on that runway. Now, despite this season of turbulence and this unprecedented time, as you called it, I believe that the architecture of the relationship does endure, even though the atmospherics may have changed. We are in turbulence, no doubt about that, but the airframe is strong and it's resilient, and I believe it will weather the storm. So my reading isn't that we misread the tea leaves, as it were, but today, I think all over the world, and this is a global phenomenon, domestic politics tends to buffet even solid partnerships, and that is particularly applicable to the United States today. So the challenge before diplomats, I think in both countries, the policymakers, the policy doers, the people in the field, their task is really to keep converting this headline risk, as it were, or neutralizing it so that the institutional ballast remains strong and can be taken forward.
Yeah, absolutely, Ambassador. You touch on a very important point, how sometimes domestic politics supersedes and intervenes into global geopolitics. Because for so long, in my previous avatar as a journalist and analyst now in DC, we speak about the US-India relationship as being politically agnostic, truly bipartisan. And in the sense, since your many years in the Foreign Service, since Pokhran 2.0, since Pokhran and Clinton 2.0 rather, we've seen every permutation combination of Democrat, Republican, BJP, Congress, and any permutation combination, and very different personalities. And even if there was not always warm ties, there was always a sense of we will really leave the relationship better than when we inherited it. And we've seen that from Clinton to Bush to Obama to Trump one to Biden. And so in some sense, we always said that the relationship is much bigger than the personality. Metaphorically, for any sport team, is much bigger than any one player. But is it coming down to a sense of Occam's razor right now, where a sense of personality and political bluster may, we miss the forest for the trees, in that personal preferences and political constituencies are impinging on a larger strategic partnership?
Well, there's no doubt that personalities define perceptions today, and they are much louder than in the past. But that in no way takes away, I believe, from the fact that the bipartisan core hasn't vanished. I mean, even if somebody was saying to me the other day that the Republican Party, really today it's a follow the leader kind of approach, and they really don't deviate from what Mr. Trump says. But I believe that the United States Congress still sees India as central to the Indo Pacific balance, for instance. And the US industry, the American industry, wants resilient supply chains with India. And of course, our militaries are exercising more than ever. So, leaders, of course, add the tempo and they add the drama. But I believe that the through line remains strategic convergence, and that I believe is larger than personal chemistry. So I believe the wise approach, or maybe the sober approach, is to hardwire cooperation into processes so that it outlasts any one leader's style. And here I'd like to just bring in this aspect. If you recall, the Leap Singh Sound, whose portrait hangs in the US Congress, the first Indian American in Congress, he once said, and I quote, what we would like is, that is, we as Indians, we would like is not to be considered foreigners or strangers at all. And this is how I would address the American heartland, but to be accepted by Americans as friends, as members of the family. And that was true of immigrants in Dilip Singh Saun's time, but it is also true of nations. So India and America today are not strangers navigating the seas in isolation. I mean, 2.5 decades of cooperation would completely uh, belie that kind of inference. We are family. We are guiding each other through uncertain waters. We're like two lighthouses, and I'll come to that later. Different shores, but the same horizon. And that's really how I would like to address the bipartisan sections of opinion in the US today.
Yeah, it's an interesting anecdote from the days of your Dilip Singh songs, because it took a while from Dilip Singh song to get Bobby Jindal, I think the second Indian American in Congress, long before he's governor of Louisiana. And of course, Dilip Singh Son's relative, if I'm not mistaken, who served in the Biden administration as Dilip Singh. And I think that's a very fascinating thing that you mentioned, Ambassador, because if I remember, quote, Nikki Haley, who perhaps doesn't identify as overtly with the Indian heritage, said once that the success story of the Indian Americans is very good at being American. The hyphenated identity perhaps is much easier. And I wanted to ask you that, Ambassador, because we speak about this strategic partnership, but the secret sauce has always been the people to people diaspora. And in some ways, given that the additional tariffs, the 25% reciprocal tariffs and the punitive tariffs for procurement of Russian energy, one hand, if at all this gets reversed, we can say it's a blip in the road. But there are real people in this relationship who may memories last, and in some ways, would it be easier to crease over that hurt a little bit and get past this?
So what you're basically saying, have, the last 2.5 decades of strategic partnership been undone by 25 days of tariffs, or all these announcements that you hear? Well, definitely, I've been saying this. The relationship has suffered bruises, no doubt about that. And the new tariffs are serious. They do bite exporters and our workers in the labor intensive export sectors, and they could nudge inflation. But they cannot erase 25 years of alignment on defense, on technology, and people to people ties, as you mentioned. So we should call the tariffs what they are, and this is how I would see them: sharp but reversible, subject to negotiation. And they are layered atop a very thick web of cooperation. So I believe we should learn and apply ourselves towards managing the shock, as it were, and not to dismantle the whole web of cooperation that we've created over the last 2.5 decades.
That's interesting that you mentioned the tariffs part, because in when President Trump took office again, unprecedentedly, because I think it only happened once before with Grover Cleveland, to serve two non-consecutive terms. And a lot has changed since 2021 when President Trump left office. We've come past the pandemic, but some things have remained the same, right? Tariffs have been a key instrument of President Trump's foreign policy. It's almost like when in doubt, tariffs. It's sort of either economic coercion or economic incentivization, as some in the administration would put it. I'm just curious right now, as we talk about these tariffs that take a toll on bilateral ties. We're also seeing economists warn about this knock-on effects, inflationary effects. Is it, an exaggeration to say that because trade in the past between U.S. and India relations has been, we can buy submarines and still argue over soybeans. It's been the one fair sparring ground. When US and Canada relations were really good, they sparred the WTO, but they never got into it. But this has really come into it. And as you rightly say, Ambassador, it's fair to say that it's political tirade that's affecting economic trade right now.
Well, there is definitely a lot of noise today, and tariffs are being used like a megaphone, not just a lever. And they have generated noise and uncertainty, and there's been a spillover effect definitely on the relationship. And you see it in the way sentiments are affected and reactions from the ground here in India about all that has happened in the relationship and all the statements emanating from spokespersons for the Trump administration and from the president himself. So, how should we deal with it? I believe the answer is not to rhetorically escalate. It is only through disciplined negotiation. And we have to look at narrow tariff carve outs where they're justified, reciprocal de escalation tied to very verifiable steps, and focus on that accelerated agenda on services and investment and standards so that trade fictions do not define the whole relationship. I believe, the strategic convergence that I spoke of, whether it's in defense or technology or, looking at global issues, that's what we need to preserve. We need to preserve that core of the relationship. And trade, yes, has to be addressed with seriousness. We have to get to the bottom of the problem. But never more than now was there the need to focus on the big picture of this indispensable partnership. And you know how crucial this relationship with the United States is. Our alignment of purpose over the last 2 decades that I just spoke of, and our policymakers have to continue to work on building stronger foundations to this relationship, whether in technology or AI or semiconductors or aerospace or biotech, quantum, joint R&D, our defense cooperation, economic ties, supply chains, intelligence sharing, and global problem solving, as the recent piece in Foreign Affairs by Kurt Campbell and Jake Sullivan argued.
Well, it was not too long ago since you mentioned AI. Prime Minister Modi did quip AI as America and India. So it's a lot has happened since then. And, Ambassador, there's a very interesting part of the relationship I want to come to because for very long, sometimes we talked about US India relations moving from estrangement to engagement and the aid to trade part because traditionally weaker countries, economically weaker countries, depend on aid. Stronger countries can negotiate on trade. And that's also where the US India relationship changed since 91, since the fall of the wall and the fall of the Soviet Union. You also saw India opening up its economy and liberalization, privatization, globalization. And all of a sudden, the allure to American consumers and American capitalist market, rather, the Indian consumers. But Washington had hyphenated India Pakistan in its post independence history from the Eisenhower era, the Dulles brothers, to the Nixon Kissinger era, which kind of saw a nadir in ties as President Nixon and Prime Minister Gandhi had Indira Gandhi had very strained ties. And of course, we saw the words of Robin Raphael when she was leading up SCA for the first time. But we would say that since 26/11 in Mumbai, the terror attacks, since the Bin Laden raid in Abbottabad, US Pakistan relations have almost been non-existent. In fact, President Obama, who went to Pakistan in his young days as a student, I believe, never went to Pakistan as president. And I- since Operation Sindoor, it's kind of come back in the forefront where it's become this Holbrook-like triangle in some ways. Whereas, we have seen Field Marshal Asim Munir that's come and wined and dined the White House, which has also added strain in the relationship, given, as you rightly said, political constituencies matter. So for people in India, they're like, why is the Field Marshal right now, after Operation Sindoor, being given a red carpet quite literally? So how has this been affected the relationship, given the New York Times has reported President Trump mediated a ceasefire and wanted credit for it, but South Bloc has said something completely different.
So I, was asked about hyphenation and India-Pakistan hyphenation or re-hyphenation, and I said, India speaks in sentences; we don't speak in hyphens. And but let me that apart. Let us look at this very clinically. Washington has always talked to Pakistan. We know that because what happens in Pakistan affects the stability of all our lives, not only our region. We know that there are ripples beyond that. whether it's Afghanistan or whether it's counterterrorism, because it really, the world has had problems as far as Pakistan is concerned on the terrorism front. Now, Pakistan's army chief being feted in the White House is perhaps, in some ways, given the spirit of the times, a theatrical representation of those trends. The fact that, these contacts have always existed, more or less beneath the surface, perhaps in recent years, but they've always been there. Now, re engagement with Rawalpindi, where the Pakistani army is garrisoned, doesn't equal rehyphenation, in my view. We should not overreact to it, but we shouldn't underprepare either, because we have to keep our counterterrorism red lines clear, and we have to keep crisis communication quiet and reliable, and we have to keep reminding our partners, particularly the United States, publicly and privately, that stability in the subcontinent rests on zero tolerance for cross-border terror. Now, talking about what President Trump has been saying, that he was able to negotiate or mediate this ceasefire between India and Pakistan. The interest that the United States has always shown for peace and stability in our region, I don't believe anybody should uh, should not welcome that. Obviously, it is based on good intentions, but I think Washington has always understood, especially in recent years, that the resolution of the basic problems, and I'm just not talking of ceasefire here, you're talking of the whole spectrum of problems between India and Pakistan, all the issues that are left to resolve or have not been resolved for 8 decades. It's the responsibility of our two countries, India and Pakistan, to really sit down and sort this out. And that is where the matter rests. External mediation is really not going to work in this context unless the world recognizes that these two countries have to resolve their problems by bilateral means. And the world should wish us well as far as that is concerned.
Of course, India has been very clear about all issues since Shimla, since Lahore Declaration, but India and Pakistan are going to be bilaterally. There's a very interesting development in the relationship since the tariffs were announced. Of course, everyone was waiting a bated breath to an extent on who the next envoy to Delhi will be, and we got that answer a few weeks ago. And speaking of envoys, ambassador, of course, you dealt with many as both in your counterpart when you were in Washington and Delhi, and of course when you were foreign secretary as well. Um, so Joe Gore was now been close to President Trump, has been anointed the next American envoy to Delhi, and of course his hearing is around the corner as I take it. Um, he's of course spoken about for his political proximity to Oval Office, or as you rightly quip, or an American Centurion card access the Oval, which is a very interesting phrase. And people were trying to make a lot of sense of this. On one hand, you may say, gone are the days of the academic doyens of John Kenneth Gabriel, or big heavily named like Chester Bowles, Frank Wisner, Tom Pickering, or even politicos and Daniel Patrick Moynihan or Richard Celeste. But Ambassador Haqqani once told me that, ambassadors don't set policy, they execute it. So this weightage has to be given in proportion to it. How do we make sense of this right now, given that it comes with a special tag of the additional envoy role as well? Is it going to be like a Steve Witkoff role for South Asia, and what does it mean for the current assistant SCA position, which Paul Kapoor is expected to take over?
We'll have to wait and see how these things pan out. Obviously, the tagging of the special envoy role on South and Central Asia has raised eyebrows in Delhi, and it's not an ideal scheme of things, to put it diplomatically. Obviously, from President Trump's side, he wants to sort of centralize or speed up, policy moves that he plans to make. But we'll have to see, because India, as you know, is no pushover. Uh, we may bend, but we don't break, and we will, stick to certain sovereign positions that we must safeguard. But a politically close ambassador, an ambassador who is close to the president, as Mr. Gore is believed to be, he or she can shorten decision loops, and pairing that with an assistant secretary like Paul Kapoor, who understands the region's dilemmas, could make the system more responsive. I'm looking at it, in an optimistic way, provided the lanes are clear. Of course, as Ambassador Haqqani said, ambassadors don't execute policy. They execute policy. They don't set it. Sorry. So the opportunity here is access plus focus, provided Washington and the White House keep a single playbook and resist mixed signals. I think India should be measured and flexible in its response to Mr. Gore's appointment, because diplomacy today is not a textbook and we should not catastrophize. The Trump administration obviously does not play by diplomatic scripts. And Mr. Gore, is a sworn loyalist of President Trump. We all know that. Of course, like you mentioned, proximity to power is not the same as being able to exercise authority in policy, as some previous American ambassadors to India did. You mentioned Mr. Galbraith, you mentioned Mr. Moynihan. So, but at the same time, I think, when we see these situations staring us in the face, as we do today, we have to avoid overt shows of unease and prepare to work with Mr. Gore. That is my feeling, and that would be my approach.
Absolutely, Ambassador. And as we talk about envoys, I want to talk about another important hat you wore, the one to Beijing, because in it was a very interesting time in China, given that India and China, we talk about the elephant and the dragon, the rise. And one of the aspects of the relationship has been, as I like to say, the elephant in the room is the dragon. The fact that the the US India relationship grew with India being seen as a democratic strategic counterweight, and now also with the security aspect of the Indo Pacific. How is Beijing trying to see what's going on right now in the current US India relations, given, we how is the CCP think tank thinking about this? How would Mr. Xi, Mr. Wang Yi, who obviously made a trip to India recently, and of course Prime Minister Modi also made a trip for the SCO summit. So, how would Beijing be seeing this and playing it to their advantage?
Well, obviously, they'll read opportunity in the situation and potential space to dilute US India cooperation and coordination. So they will probe, as they tend to do, but not with fanfare, with pressure along the line of actual control, let us say, in the Indian Ocean, in various standard setting bodies. So that's precisely why I've been saying we should compartmentalize the trade spats that we have with Washington on a separate track, while maintaining, the defense and tech cooperation tracks with the United States. Because for Beijing, from their vantage point, a distracted US India axis is a strategic dividend. And our job is to deny that dividend.
Hmm. I wanted to stay on China a little bit because, of course, the SCO summit made a lot of headlines. Tianjin, known as the Summer Davos, and of course, you saw the photo op with Prime Minister Modi, President Putin, Mr. Xi, and a lot has been made out of it. President Trump also commented on his Truth Social about it, and on one hand, some commentators spoke about with is it a pivot away from Washington, as you know, as your recent foreign policy interview touched on that. But some others may say, look, it's business as normal. New Delhi has been a SCO member. One of New Delhi's foreign policy has always been to speak to Pakistan on counterterrorism through that forum as well. So, in some ways, it was just business as usual. India exercising its strategic autonomy to speak to China on the issues that on the contested border issues, on issues that bilaterally affect both countries. So, because we would not know, it's an alternate universe. If these tariff announcements had not happened, would Prime Minister Modi have gone? So, what's fact, what's fiction here?
If you're looking at the SEO summit optics, all those photo opportunities, I mean, especially in the Western media, they were read as a pivot away from Washington. But I would say it's business as usual in as far as India's lexicon of multi-alignment is concerned, because India is a long-standing SEO member. And attendance at the summit does not in any way dilute, for instance, our Indo Pacific or our Quad commitments. I think what it signals to the world is that India will engage where our interests require, whether it's energy, whether it's Central Asian connectivity, whether it's counterterrorism. And while we keep our values-based coalitions open with the United States and our partners across the world, so multipolarity is not about chaos. It's not a mood. It's really a method. It's an approach because this is the way our diplomacy functions and where we are as a country geographically, historically, economically, developmentally, in terms of our security. This really is the best way. And no, you had, of course, Mr. Wang Yi in Delhi and Mr. Modi went to Tianjin for the summit. But if you're asking me whether, as far as India and China are concerned, and this is, of course, this signal that should be read by the United States too, is it a reset or it's an uncomfortable thaw? I presume that's what you would like me to talk about too. So I would say it's an uncomfortable thaw with China because after Galwan, which happened exactly 5 years ago, a little over 5 years ago, trust is an absent commodity in this relationship. And any political engagement that we have with the Chinese leadership or with the Chinese establishment is tactical, it's not transformational. What is clear is that dialogue reduces risk. It reduces the risk of conflict, but it doesn't erase the chill of memory. I spoke about that in something I recently wrote. We should talk. We should talk with China. We should stabilize. But we should not pretend, even for a moment, that equilibrium has been restored. We have to put in place the guardrails, and we can talk about rapprochement later, but that's a long way off because there are problems to be resolved, not just on the border or along the line of actual control, but also as far as economic activity with China is concerned, and the huge trade deficit that we have with China, the challenges that we face as far as procurement of certain critical commodities and items are required for our manufacturing revolution from China. So we have to reduce those critical dependencies. For instance, in pharmaceuticals, look at the APIs, the proportion of APIs that we import from China, and that, in a sense, affects the US also because I believe it's is it 40% or is it 60% of the pharmaceuticals that are sold in the United States, the generic pharmaceuticals come from India. So you see the way, what a tangled web it is. So this is where we are with China. Very, very complex relationship. A lot of burdens of memory and history carried with it. Plus, of course, the current situation with the rise of China as a superpower in our region, and all the complications that come with it. An assertive, muscular, nationalist China under Xi Jinping.
Yeah, Ambassador, the best part about having conversations with experts like yourself, you answer the next set of questions because that's the perspicacity here. The memory part is very fascinating. If I can stay on that for a little bit, because we've spoken about this with US India relations also, the hesitations of history, which sort of hangs over your head like a sword of Damocles. And of course, with India and China, because the world sees China sort of this antagonist. And India has seen it long when India was economically vulnerable, security vulnerable. India shares one of the longest borders in the world with China. And given that trust deficit has been around, because some may look at Prime Minister Nehru, who probably trusted China a little much like a Trojan horse, some may call it, and of course, since the days of Mao and Nehru, it's kind of always hung overhead since 62. And we saw when Prime Minister Modi, when he was Chief Minister Modi, would make trips to China for Vibrant Gujarat Summit and spoke about the India-China rise, what India can do, because there's never been two countries with a billion plus population. And but then of course we had the Xi'an summit, and then rewarded with the Doklam uh, crisis, and then you had the Mamlapuram reset, and then you had Galvan. So I don't want to say history repeats itself, but there is a tendency for it to rhyme. So with Wang Yi's visit, and you touched on PM Modi going to China, there is does India New Delhi have to sleep with one eye open when it comes to China? So we will have a reset, but we'll wait and see before we go any economic partnership of grand gesture.
I mean, the costs of dealing with a neighbor like China is eternal vigilance. I don't believe we can afford to let our guard down, given the history of the relationship and given the burden of memory that we carry, and the fact that current realities tell you there is evidence before your very eyes that this is an unresolved boundary between the two countries. Essentially, it's life without maps, literally, when it comes to dealing with China. I mentioned elsewhere that, dealing with China is like playing three-dimensional chess in the dark. And the Chinese have a way of knocking over the board even as they smile to the cameras. So I think we have learned a great deal from dealing with China over the years. So we are cautious. Uh, there is a lot of circumspection. We are aware of the fact that trust is absent. But we see the need for dialogue. We see the need to work towards the resolution of problems, to reduce tension along our border, to de-escalate, to disengage, which is a process that began last year, as you know, before the BRICS Kazan summit, where Mr. Modi and Xi met briefly, as you're aware. So this is an ongoing process, but this is not the kind of relationship that we have with the United States. It is nowhere near that relationship. It is a relationship that we have with a very large neighbor, a neighbor next door to us, that literally, in a sense, is trying to dominate the
Mm.
heights in the Himalayas. So, as I said, we are in a situation where we have to be eternally vigilant vis-a-vis China.
And that eternal vigilance comes down to another reason as well. Joe Nye recently passed away and was famous for codifying the term soft power. It's one of the moments when when I was fanboying over seeing an academic when I met him, because I think soft power is so profound because soft power essentially tells stories of culture, civilizations, people, cuisines better than any government can. And I think the way I think about this is there is American Dream was the best soft power example there was. But there is no Chinese dream for you and me, someone who's not native as Han Chinese, irrespective of how well you speak Mandarin or understand Confucius or understand China's history from the Ming Dynasty. But I'm just curious because during my journalism days, Giorgio, the former Singapore foreign minister, said something that everyone wants the US as a friend, no one wants China as an enemy. And that sets the tone clearly because even if China were to surpass the US economically, as some have forecasted, there'll never be a Chinese soft power the same way. And more importantly, right now, is America eroding America's own soft power? Because that's sort of the concern. Is the American dream fading? Is what made America with MTV, Hollywood, and McDonald's and subsequently since then is America taking away its own soft power?
Well, America's edge, as I see it, is still its open society, universities, entertainment, the hope of immigration for a lot of people around the world, entrepreneurship, just the traditions and the reputations that they have established in that field. So it's a very evocative presence across the world, America's presence. Even the name, in India, a lot of people say Amrika. It's a name that resonates in the minds of billions as a place where dreams come true. I mean, if it wasn't for that soft power and the prospects that America is able to sort of radiate to the rest of the world. I mean, people, braving the Darien Gap, for instance, to kind of sneak into America. What does that mean? There is some very magnetic attraction there, combined with the prospect of offering a better life. And it's a magnetism that survives policy swings. I'm not at all for illegal immigration, but I'm just talking of, the pull of America. And a lot of it rests on its soft and economic power. Now, China's economic heft is enormous, but it's not attracting people to its shores because it has really no soft power to communicate to the rest of the world. I mean, it may have some soft power in Southeast Asia, for instance, or in countries that have Chinese-speaking populations. I mean, you see the success of that animation film Nersha, which did very well in Southeast Asia, but it completely tanked in the United States when it showed in cinemas. So you see that China's soft power really doesn't have appeal beyond a very, very defined space, as it were. not beyond, not the world beyond. And in fact, even the youth of China model themselves culturally today on American soft power, Korean K-pop, and they embrace Western culture, mostly American. So this is American soft power. Of course, America can squander goodwill through unpredictability and rhetoric that targets partners, and we've seen that a little in action. But the remedy is simple, and at the same time, yes, it is challenging. You have to, provide that consistency of approach, not only at home but also in terms of reliability abroad. So, really speaking, in fact, I'd like to add here, Akshobh, that we all grew up, with this what was taught to us that America is that city on the hill, a place where others look up to. And I would add that, for a country like India, coming from India and being the world's largest democracy, and, in a sense, our democratic traditions and our constitutional precepts and all are so bound up with your traditions in the United States as you move forward into commemorating the 250th anniversary of your independence. And I would add then, therefore, that India and the United States, standing on different shores, we can really serve, and this is in the soft power context, we can serve as twin lighthouses of democracy. And, a lighthouse doesn't need to proclaim itself, just as American power doesn't need to proclaim itself, but it steadies all of us around the world. And, you have your experiment in liberty. We have, of course, our vast democracy that is built on diversity. But together, India and the United States can really cast beams of light across the world in a very unsettled world. So that's why I always say the value of our partnership is not in dazzling people, but in guiding with steadiness and a sense of shared responsibility. I wanted to bring that city on the hill concept when you raised this issue of soft power. I thought I'd mention it.
No, absolutely. And even though Ronald Reagan would say America is a shining city on the hill, or President Obama spoke about how a kid with a funny name could make it. And it may sound like political stump speeches written by immaculate speechwriters, but there is a method in the madness. There is the profoundness of soft power. And I feel we could do a whole podcast on soft power, but I would be remiss if I didn't kind of ask you this question on soft power because the two examples you mentioned, the first one, Korea, which I just think about in the last decade alone, from Gangnam Style to K-pop to Parasite to Squid Games. It's not like Korea colonized the world, so there are 10 countries that speak Korean. And the beauty about that is not Korea doing anything for the world; it's Korea being itself. And I think that's the
Yeah,
best part of soft power, the natural
ab-
attraction. And
absolutely.
India too has had that with the sense when we talk about yoga and Bollywood and cuisines. But given the asymmetry of power, between the US and India, um, America means something in Kanpur. India doesn't mean the same thing in Kansas City. So there is also the cognizance of the economic asymmetry, and there's still, as the poet would say, many miles to go before we can sleep.
No, I agree. And when you talked of, how, I mean, how does it play in Peoria, as the Americans say? And,
Mm,
obviously, very few people in America have a in-depth understanding of India. It's very difficult. I remember that book, that very classic book by Harold Isaacs from 1958 called Scratches on Our Minds. And it really spoke about the kind of impressions and the kind of images that Americans carried in their minds of China and India. And the contrast was very vivid. The understanding of China, or the, relating to China, as it were, the attraction to China was so much more in the American mind. I'm talking of just, this is in the 50s at the height of the Cold War. Uh, but that attraction to China was so much deeper because the ignorance about India was so deep. And when there is this darkness of ignorance, then, all kinds of stereotypes build up. And prejudice is, the product also of that. So we have a great deal to do as far as working on our image, I believe, in the United States is concerned also. We just need to close that information gap. You know what I
yeah.
mean?
Yeah, especially in Peoria, the good way to bring US and India together because Congressman Krishnamurthy does identify for being from Peoria, Illinois. And
So,
as you rightly said, yeah, there is no Indian dream for someone from Janesville, Wisconsin. So that's another thing to think about as well. Ambassador, just to maybe try and a little more harsher segue to a hard part right now, because you wrote something or said something very profound. You said a three body equilibrium, a delicate balancing act. Speaking about U.S., China, and Russia for India, it's sort of a Larange point, as you said. For U.S., we're dealing with a trade spats to not preclude into the larger technological defense pillars. We want to reduce border disputes and trade dependency with China, particularly on supply chains, and with Russia, maintain the traditional relationship of defense, the pre-Soviet relationship that India has nurtured, and of course, the energy bargains. But some may think that's putting both feet in two different boats. And in this case, you have three very different modes. And one of them, the energy exports, has come back to hit one of the other relationship we have right now with the US. So if at all I may play devil's advocate, is New Delhi biting on more than it can chew?
I don't think so because yes, it is a three-body problem as I spoke of it: the United States, China, and Russia, and how we kind of
Yeah.
balance our relationships with all three. But I don't believe this is overstretch. It is hard, but it's not impossible to achieve that balance either. Because energy security, take the problems with Russia now. Energy security is a national interest for India, as it is for any other country in the world. And we diversified when markets were chaotic. And in fact, the previous US administration understood our position and endorsed it. So the new tariff response from the United States linking energy to trade has come as a surprise and definitely has generated very unfortunate impacts on the relationship. It creates a rift that we need to resolve and mitigate and overcome. And I would suggest that we now propose a very structured glide path, greater transparency, yes, on oil purchases, expanded buys from the United States and others, and joint work on a kind of price cap compliance in exchange for tariff relief. So the strategy is all about sequencing. We de risk with China, we depoliticize energy with the United States. And of course, with Russia, there are certain legacy ties that we have to maintain, particularly in defense. And, that component of dependency on Russia is definitely coming down, no doubt. But there are but the dependency has not been completely removed, especially when it comes to defense equipment spares and certain purchases that we have to continue to undertake with Russia. All this, I mean, these are today's realities, and we have to deal with realities. That's really how nations have to rise to the occasion, as it were.
Yeah. Ambassador, I'm going to cite your foreign affairs article which you wrote, which I think was really profoundly written, where you describe India as a liminal power, a state standing on a geopolitical threshold, deliberately navigating ambiguity to preserve flexibility and autonomy in a global order that's simply cleaving in two, but fracturing in more complicated ways. India's foreign policy is best understood through the lens of liminality, the condition of existing between worlds rather than a fixed role or within a block. India, as you say, is not a classic great power, but neither is merely a regional actor, a titan in a chrysalis. This is a very profound way because it really unpacks so much from the hesitation of history to India's geographic concerns to the way India sees the world. But Washington didn't understand non-alignment during the Cold War. Long before Bush 43, it was with us or against us. And ergo, some would say that's how the Pakistan-US relationship began. And this, in terms of New Delhi's multipolarity, which is rightly so in a world that, as you rightly say, is cleaving in many different directions. Um, but if at all, again, not to play devil's advocate, but Dr. Tellus's original Foreign Affairs op-ed says that New Delhi's multipolarity could be a liability, especially now with the administration that thinks transactionally. President Trump prefers direct bilateral relationships over the larger geostrategic minilateral, what is NATO, what is Quad, what is IMEC. So does India have to rethink some of that strategy?
I really don't think so. And I argued that in my response to Ashley's piece, and you quoted from it, so I don't need to go over it again. But multipolarity is a reality. It's also where we approach it. We have the tools in our kit. We don't see it as a talisman, but we don't see it as a liability either. It becomes a liability only if you slip into posture without performance. So multipolarity, I'd like to tell my American friends, because I know they keep throwing terms like non-alignment and multipolarity and strategic autonomy at us. I mean, it seems like they have never understood where we come from on these issues. I'd like to say that we're not sitting on the fence. We're trying to build more bridges. You know, we want to promote our development. For instance, with the US, what all that we're doing, in terms of business ties, investment, technology, we're building bridges. We're trying to close the loop for ourselves. We want to finish long pending issues that matters, and achieve the goals that we've set for ourselves, because the destiny and the well-being of 1.4 billion people depends on it. So when successful outcomes accumulate with all the countries with which we have ties, multipolarity, then you can see how multipolarity functions like leverage. It's not being indecisive. It's not, sitting on the fence. And that's why what I tried to explain in my foreign affairs piece, from which you quoted. So Ashley Tellis, I know, sees India's pursuit of multipolarity as a strategic liability. But as I said in my article, multipolarity for us is a kind of adaptive realism. It's a very intentional, deliberate pivoting strategy that India follows, and it's necessitated by our geography, by our history, and of course the structural constraints in the international system. That's where we stand.
It also seemed like a natural evolution from unipolar, bipolar, and multipolar because as several regional actors, as more economies have come to the forefront and been decolonized since the 60s. Um, uh, Ambassador, again, coming to this profound piece of writing, and I encourage everyone to read it if you haven't, because I've read it 3, 4 times, and I'm probably going to revisit again for my additional learning. Um, you again mentioned India is not trying to dominate the world order. It's trying to reshape it within by leading a coalition of middle and rising powers. It's that are uncomfortable with both Chinese authoritarianism and Western paternalism. That strategy may be imperfect, but it is not incoherent. And you are going to add strategic patience, not alignment, is a rational choice. Um, we've seen right now, given tariffs are a whopping 50%, India's sort of played the patient game. India didn't kind of go into it as, some of the other administration folks may have made some comments on the media cycle because that would just give on to a vicious cycle. So is the strategic patience the one you spoke about that even when, as Rudyard Kipling would say, when others are losing their heads, hold your own. And the fact that we've seen right now with President Trump's latest Truth Social comment and Prime Minister Modi's tweets, perhaps as a mend. And so this patience that you spoke about is bearing fruition.
Yes, and I've always said that patience is not passivity. We're not being passive. And I think, the surface looks calm, but we should paddle very vigorously underneath the surface of the water. And we have to pursue, a couple of fast tracks in parallel, India and the US. First of all, let's target de escalation, the reciprocal tariff suspensions that we need, linked to measurable steps on energy transparency and market access. Let's accelerate the trust compact deliverables in chips, in space, in defense co production, so that we create constituencies for stability. And as far as India is concerned, I think we need to diversify. We need to spread the export risk to third markets while all this is happening, while we are negotiating. And that's not capitulation. That's not, declaring surrender. It's kind of it's statecraft under pressure, or grace under pressure, if you can call it that. So the relationship is too consequential for us to let a tariff spike define it. That's how I would look at it.
I keep saying I won't. I'll only quote it once, but I devoured the foreign affairs article so much. And the another part that stood out with me was you said India is not standing still; it's moving forward, not by mirroring great powers, but by leveraging unilateralism, smaller scale collaboration with a few countries, and issue based coalitions. And speaking of unilateral, I have to ask the Quad. India was supposed to host it last year, but President Biden, as his farewell song, invited the other three leaders to Delaware. And come to think of it, since the 2021 first gathering, Prime Minister Modi is the only one who still remains in office because Australia, Japan, and Washington have all changed their respective
Yeah.
leaders. it's hard to crystal ball gaze, Ambassador, but I would have to ask you, how do you see the Quad Summit going on in New Delhi? Maybe now positive signs from yesterday, but do you still see it happening sometime in November?
Well, I'm in Bangalore, and it's very, as they say, Dilli dur ast. It's quite Delhi is far away. But jokes apart, I think form has to follow function always. And if our leaders' calendars collide, with political responsibilities, then of course the ministers step in, and there's a lot of work that goes on at the Sherpa level also, and that helps keep pace on the issues that are central to our cooperation within Quad, whether it's maritime domain awareness, critical technology, HADR, supply chain resilience. Of course, a leaders' summit is ideal, and I think and I certainly hope that does happen. But in case it's not possible, then a purposeful ministerial is better than an empty photo op, if you ask me, because the Quad's credibility rests on deliverables, not on decibels, not on the noise level, and not on panache. That's my feeling.
That's my final question. Since you mentioned you're in Bangalore, India, Silicon Valley, and startup capital as well. One of the things we worked on last year was IndusX that came about during the very high level Prime Minister state visit in 2023 that came part of, through ISET as well, and now a renamed trust. One of the things I found fascinating about IndusX when we did it last year at Stanford and Silicon Valley, it was moving away from Washington and New Delhi. In some ways, for Silicon Valley, was going back to the military industrial complex, but also kind of showing that the relationship is gone beyond diplomats and bureaucrats and ministers and presidents and secretaries. It kind of now feels like a mutual fund, if I may, where the startups or the VCs or the PEs, the academics, everyone feels part of the relationship. Like startups in Bangalore, and as India privatizes space sectors, you see more space startups now playing a very important part of this relationship. So in some sense, shooting for the stars, quite literally and metaphorically.
Yes, shooting for the stars. And I'd say it's cities like Bangalore, I mean, far away from the political capitals, but in a sense, because of all that is happening, the cutting edge sort of technology that is being developed, the kind of bridges of cooperation and communication and coordination with the United States. I mean, these are the beams of light. You said, shooting for the stars. These are the beams of light that keep cooperation steady through whatever storm we're passing through. Really speaking, that's the role that cities like mine play.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm sure we'll get past this temporary storm and come back to the strong ties that you, Ambassador, played not just a key part in, but help shape, drive, and be a key architect of. But at your time as ambassador to the United States, as foreign secretary, and of course, of your many years in foreign service. So, Ambassador Nirupama Rao, thank you so much for joining me, and it has been a pleasure. It's all been all mine. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.